Okay, so chapter 4, the basics of qualitative research. These are things I have generally taken from other people. Now, you don't need to follow this video at all if you're not interested. I would encourage you, though, to at least follow the video so you have some general idea of what qualitative research is about. The reason for this is if you read an article or a paper or a chapter in a book and they've used qualitative research methods, personally I think you should have some understanding of what they're doing, and in particular at least how the conceptual framework is different from quantitative research. So in this table here I'm listing 5 different qualitative research methodologies. So this is quite different to quantitative research. In quantitative research, generally it's based on probability samples and statistical analysis. While there are some variations in the methodology, they're generally based on the same principles. Whereas in qualitative research, that's not the case. So in fact, even this table is a little arguable. Some people would argue there are more than 5 methodologies, but these are the 4 most common methodologies. They all have a different focus. They have a different disciplinary background, different types of data, different types of analysis. So for example, biography is essentially a detailed picture of individuals' lives. So the focus is to explore the life of individuals. This comes from anthropology. We generally would collect interviews and documents, and we would analyze these stories. An epiphany means a life-changing event, if you like, something special that occurred in these people's lives, and understanding the historical context of their life. Phenomenology, so as I said, phenomenology is something we observe. So some phenomenon, we want to understand that phenomenon. This comes out of psychology. Generally, it would be a long interview with a relatively small number of people, trying to understand their experiences in detail. So we're trying to come to a description of what is the essence of this experience so that we can formulate some framework for how we're going to measure responses to this phenomenon. The third one is the one which perhaps is generally most useful, grounded theory. This is helping us to develop a theory or model. So this is inductive, but where we're starting without much data to start with. So usually when scientists think about induction, they're assuming we've already got some failed theories and then we're just trying to update those. But grounded theory is more about we've got this new problem to try and understand, and we don't even have any hypotheses to start with. So generally, this comes from sociology. You start with interviews, what we call saturate categories. We'll talk about saturation in a minute. You're trying to code these interviews in terms of what are the conceptual elements of these interviews, in terms of how people thought about this problem. And then you're trying to develop some form of a theory to summarize what we know to start with about this data, based on this data, so that we might be able to develop some hypotheses. Ethnography is based about cultural or social groups. So this could be, you've observed how these group of people behave. Say you've watched people, how they use WhatsApp, for example. So you want to try and understand this group of people who use WhatsApp in a particular way. Why do they use it this way? How do they use it? And so on. So that would be an extended fieldwork to do observation as well as interviews, usually to understand how this group behaves. And then a case study is in-depth analysis of a relatively small number of cases. So this generally comes out of political science. So something like the return of sovereignty of Hong Kong to the mainland. As I said, you could look at Hong Kong, you could look at Macau, and it's hard to find other similar cases to compare. Right? So you might look at these 2 cases in great detail to try and understand what happened with the return of sovereignty. Now, qualitative research is generally a process of understanding based on a tradition of inquiry that explores a problem. You want a complex, holistic picture. You're not assuming it's a simple story. You're trying to make sure the study is done in a natural setting. There's often many variables and relatively few cases, so accepting it may not be generalizable to the whole population. I'm not going to go through the methodologies in detail here. What I'm going to skip forward to is to talk about qualitative sampling, because I think this is important to understand how qualitative sampling is quite different. So generally, qualitative sampling is not based around probabilistic sampling. They're not focused on representative sampling because it's an exploratory research and usually the sample sizes are small. So what are the key ideas in qualitative sampling rather than probability? So the first concept to understand is saturation. The idea of saturation is to collect data until you're not getting anything new. So for example, you want to understand how young children learn how to write Chinese characters. So you observe children, you analyze samples of their work, and you become aware that after a while, you're not getting anything you haven't seen before. Or in my case, if I wanted to understand how you all are getting on with my class, I might do saturation sampling, where I would keep asking some of you to interview for an interview until I don't learn anything new. Okay? Now, the second framework, which can overlap, is theoretical or purposeful sampling. So here, this says if we think we know which factors will influence the outcomes, then we try to draw a sample that has a wide range of responses by sampling across all factors. So, for example, if you want to understand what yields maths students to do very well, so one maths department has an excellent reputation, so you might study this particular maths department in detail to try and understand why they do well. Or in the case of this class, if I believe that your discipline is very important, then I would try to sample students from each discipline to make sure I've understood how discipline may influence how you respond to my teaching. Then convenience sampling. This is where sampling is driven by feasibility. So this may be suitable for a very small study where I have no idea and I don't have much resources. So I might just ask you all to volunteer for interviews if I don't have the budget to draw any form of a sample. So I've just asked those of you who are willing to set aside some time to answer a questionnaire for me, an open-ended questionnaire where you tell me something about what your experience was with this class. Okay? So I don't have much time and you don't have much time, so I would only focus on the people who are willing to spend their time. And then lastly, snowball. So this would be where I have to rely on referrals. So something like drug addicts. I might start from people I know to be drug addicts and then ask them to refer me to their friends who are drug addicts because it's too hard for me to find drug addicts on my own to interview. Okay? So you can see these are very different framings for sampling from a probabilistic sample. So sometimes quantitative researchers are dismissive of qualitative research because they don't use probability samples. But that's actually not a valid reason to criticize. You just need to recognize that different approaches have their own strengths and weaknesses. So the strength of qualitative research is it usually gives a much deeper story, a much deeper picture about what the processes are behind this, even if we're not sure whether we can generalize those findings. And then the last thing I want to highlight is computer-assisted software. So most people know that for quantitative research, there is software available for use, but that's also true for qualitative analysis. So Hong Kong U, for example, has relatively cheap licenses for in vivo. You can use Excel and SPSS, but I don't recommend it. They're not very good for this particular purpose. Okay? So that brings us to the end of chapter 4.